All right, the queen of my former home and my second favorite nation has died after a 70-year reign. Long live the king, King Charles III. Elizabeth II, she took the throne during Harry Truman's presidency. It was before I was born, as proving at least that there actually was a time before I was born. She met 13 presidents. One of her favorite, I think her favorite was Reagan. She loved Reagan. 15 prime ministers. Liz Truss, the new prime minister, will now be the first prime minister since Churchill to serve under two monarchs. She took the throne right after World War II, and I guess it was 1952, I think. She was the last public official to have served in the military in World War II in uniform. She oversaw the more or less willing retreat from the empire, and you're going to hear the left complaining, oh, the horrible British Empire. The British Empire was one of the best things that ever happened to humankind. You always remember that both uncivilized and civilized nations commit atrocities, terrible atrocities, but only civilized nations improve the common lot of humankind. Empire is a way of spreading the best ideas, the good ideas. It's a brute way. I hope we find a better way than empire, but they spread the ideas that led to our Constitution. And she oversaw their more or less peaceful withdrawal from that. I always hate when somebody important dies and they show pictures of her in her last days all the time. Let's go back. Here's a little clip of her and her celebrating her 21st birthday. I guess that would be about 4 years, I think, before she became queen. She's Princess Elizabeth here.
I can make my solemn act of dedication with the whole empire listening. I should like to make that dedication now. It is very simple. I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Now, it's dedicated to your service, and we'll get back to that concept of service. That's the word you're going to hear over and over and over again about her. It's a very important word. You're going to hear a lot of historical stuff. You're not going to have to get that here. I'm going to say something a little different. A lot of people have been eulogizing her, of course, and the King Charles III made his speech, his first speech. The best speech I've heard so far was from Boris Johnson, the last prime minister who spoke in Parliament for about 8 minutes. Here's a little bit of that.
Think what we asked of her in that moment, not just to be the living embodiment in her DNA of the history and continuity and unity of this country, but to be the figurehead of our entire system, the keystone in the vast arch of the British state, a role that only she could fulfill because in the brilliant and durable bargain of the constitutional monarchy, only she could be trusted to be above any party political or commercial interest and to incarnate impartially the very concept and essence of the nation.
So that's the concept I'm going to be talking about. She was the incarnation of the concept of Britain. I remember this. I lived in Britain, in London, for most of the 90s, and I remember being very touched and moved by her Christmas address every year when she would come on and talk about the year and the things that had happened, and had the strange effect of stopping the world for a few minutes. And you could look at the world for a minute without the politics. All of that faded away, and she was just the incarnation of Britain speaking. She stood for Britain. I was there during the tumult that happened when King Charles III, then Prince Charles's marriage collapsed to Princess Di, the very popular Princess Di, in 1992 at her 40th anniversary, celebrating her 40th year as queen. She made her famous Annus Horribilis speech. That's Latin for horrible year. The tabloids called it her bum year because annus sounds like anus and bum is the British word for backside. So that was the culture she was speaking into, this vulgarian culture, this culture that was collapsing. But she remained this dignified person who said wonderfully of this terrible year she had. She said, 1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. So that was the culture her saying her bum year, get it, and her speaking in that beautiful way. Her horrible year was the year in which Prince Andrew dumped his wife Fergie, and she showed up in the tabloids with her new lover sucking her toes or something. And then, of course, the revelations came. Princess Diana gave an interview breaking sort of that cone of silence around the throne about how her marriage to Prince Charles, which had been this fairy tale marriage that everybody loved and everyone loved her, and how it was just an absolute disaster. And the thing that's really interesting to this is that she came to power because of a scandal, Edward VIII's abdicating the throne so he could marry the divorcee Wallis Simpson. That shifted things so that Elizabeth's father became the king, and it put her in the line of succession. And then she reigned for 70 years without a scandal, but her children began to have that scandal, the scandals, the Princess Di marriage, Andrew and Fergie, and of course now her grandson giving up his duties to go off with this loudmouth, egotistical American actress, Meghan Markle. A wonderful headline recently, Meghan Markle won't hide. I thought, let her hide. She hasn't hidden for 2 seconds. She's such an egotist. Here's the thing that got me about her, too, when I lived there, was I had a lot of friends across the spectrum, across the political spectrum. I had far, far leftist friends. I had middle-of-the-road friends. I had some conservative friends or conservative people that I knew. And many of them thought the monarchy was old-fashioned and we should get rid of it. Not one of them was willing to say they should get rid of it while Elizabeth was queen. Nobody thought they could or would want to destroy it while she was on the throne. And why? Why is that? How could she reach out across the aisle? And it's simple. She did the job she was asked to do, the job that Boris described. She incarnated the nation, and she did it through service, right? And now the reason service is so important, that word is so important, is it is the essence of a Christian leader, right? Jesus said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the superiors exercise authority over them, right? So you get like kind of that Joe Biden type thing. But it shall not be that way among you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And that's why Jesus washed the feet of the apostles. She represented the nation, she incarnated the nation, the spirit of the nation as a servant. This is the Britain of the imagination. So when you saw her, you saw Britain. So why do some leftists are sneering at her death? She's dead, and the terrible colonial system that she represented is over. But it's more than that. It's much more than politics. The idea of kingship began to recede in the age of revolutions, right? Our revolution, when we chose not to have a king, even though Washington could have been crowned king. And then the French Revolution, when the famous philosophe Denis Diderot wrote a poem that's frequently paraphrased, man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. Very fierce way of saying we've got to get rid of these people. Why did that happen? Why was that so terrible to them? Was it that all kings were tyrants? Was it that the peasants were starving and the king was like Mel Brooks running around after the women? No, because that's happening now. As Boris Johnson pointed out in his speech, the Queen drove her own car. It was only the politicians, as he said, who have their bulletproof cars and their security detail and all that. The Queen was driving around the Scottish Highlands in her own car. So what is the hostility toward kings? It's because in this period of revolution, the idea of God was beginning to die. And when the idea of God dies, the idea that there is a realm of meaning above nature, which is just flesh and blood, our flesh, that there's a realm of meaning above that, goes out of fashion. What do you mean you represent Britain? There is no Britain. Britain is just us. It's just this piece of ground. There's just this history. It's just this thing they're doing. There can't be a supernatural Britain, a Britain of the imagination, a Britain of the mind, a Britain that exists, whether Britain is there or not. Just like when we talk about the church, we don't mean the Vatican. We don't mean this church or that church. We mean the church in our minds, the church that exists as an abstract thing. And this is the issue we're wrestling with, all of us today. Do we represent anything? Is this just a body that comes and goes, meat with chemicals inside, and when it's dead, it's gone? Or is this body like a word that represents an idea? This body represents a self, me. Your body represents a self, you. If that's not true, you start to ask yourself, well, I have a body of a man, but what's manhood? That it should be represented by me. Do I have a responsibility to be manly? If you're a woman, do you have a responsibility to be womanly, to be feminine? Or are you free to be whatever you want to be? Just because you were born that way, why can't you cut up your body and make it look different and have a different sex and tell everybody you're a different sex? What is your responsibility to the way you were born? Why should the Queen, just because she was born in that bloodline, represent England? You heard Boris Johnson say it. She represented it in her DNA. And this can be a complicated question. Not all the answers are easy. I was born a Jew, and many Jews write to me and say, you did an irresponsible thing by accepting Christ. You should have explored your own religion. I did explore it. That's not fair. But still, they feel that the very fact that I was born a Jew means that I'm responsible to upholding my Jewishness. And it's a really complicated question. If you read my memoir, I wrestled with that very question for months and months when I realized I believed in Christ and obviously made the decision that I made. But then there is yourself. There's the fact that you represent yourself. The Queen represents England, but you represent yourself. And it's only when you give up that representation that you think you can do whatever you want, right? There's a moral world. If you represent yourself, then shouldn't you be living into that self you represent? Obviously, that self you represent isn't your body, because your body comes and goes. It is something else. It is something you sense yourself to be. You should be, but you aren't. So you ask yourself, well, if there's no supernatural morality, if there's no meaning to my actions, if when I give a beggar bread, that means exactly the same thing as if I torture a child to death, there's no supernatural world in which one is, and when I say supernatural, I mean above nature, the meaning of nature. There's no supernatural meaning in which one thing is bad and one thing is good, then I can just rewrite morality to be whatever I think it is, whatever serves me in the moment. We don't, if we represent a spirit, then we have to consult that spirit. We have to consult our conscience. We have to consult our traditions, because other people have consulted consciences and we're piling up all that information. We have to consult all that stuff and our reason to get rid of old moralities that don't work anymore or weren't right to begin with. And we are responsible to that supernatural world. But with the death of God, Western culture decided that no one could represent anything, and what you wanted personally became all, right? You couldn't represent a country or an idea, marriage. Your marriage didn't represent Christ in the church. None of that was going to work anymore. It was just about what you want. So Edward VIII, when he ran off with Wallace and said, I cannot continue without the help and support of the woman I love, was basically saying my responsibility to the crown doesn't matter. I don't represent England. I am just myself. When Meghan Markle says, I can't do this is too hard, and she runs back to America and her mansion to weep about how badly she's being treated, she is saying the same thing. In between this, for 70 years, the Queen defied that modern idea simply by showing that she could do it, that she could, in fact, represent Britain, an idea of Britain, and make that idea come to life in people's minds. People in England dreamed about the Queen. They're weeping for the Queen. This is going to be a genuine emotional shock that they're going to have to go through. I was talking to some British friends just a couple of weeks ago. They were over my house, and they were talking about this is going to be something very difficult for us to deal with and for everybody to deal with, because she did the thing that they said you can't do. They say, well, you can't represent manhood. You can't represent womanhood. You don't have any responsibility to your body. You don't have any responsibility to the way you were made. Queen Elizabeth said, yes, I do, and I will, and she did, and that disproves everything that they said. She proved it as the culture around her became vulgar and foul-mouthed and egotistical. She remained true to the idea of who she was and who she was born to be. That's an amazing thing. That's an amazing disproof of the modern idea. It is an amazing disproof it's not a disproof of individual freedom, it's a disproof of the idea that individual freedom has no limits. That individual freedom is not responsible, it's not a collaboration with God, with the things that you are made and with the moral world that you were made. So when we talk about the crisis that our country is going through, and when you wonder how you can change the culture, how you can come through this current crisis to a better America, with a better population, with better people, you have to ask yourself this: what do you represent? What were you made to represent? What are your responsibilities to the way you were born and who you were born as? What do you symbolize to people, to your children, to your wife, to your husband? What do you symbolize to them? What do you make incarnate? And what person, what morality, what soul? It is amazing. It is absolutely amazing, the power of a single person who lives into the meaning of her life, who lives into that supernatural meaning of her life. You don't have to be queen to do that. You don't have to be a king to do that. You can just be an ordinary person living into the meaning of who God made them to be. That's why people are going to be so upset by this. That's why people are going to miss her. Even people who don't live in England, who don't care about England, are going to understand that when she passed, something big left the scene. I know you want more great stuff like this, so like and subscribe to the Andrew Klavan Podcast.